Hello everyone, welcome to Dr. Yang's Life Tip channel. I'm Dr. Yang. If you are new to my channel, please do remember, subscribe to my channel. You will not miss any new videos in the future. Today I'm going to talk to you about, do you need to upgrade your iPad? Or which iPad model is the best for you? To answer that question, we have to go to the rationale behind the iPad. Steve Jobs said, what we want to do is we want to put an incredibly great computer in a book that you can carry around with you and learn how to use it in 20 minutes. And we really want to do it with the radio link in it, so you do not have to hook up to anything and you are in communication with all of those large databases and other computers. So this is the rationale behind the iPad. When you choose the iPad, when you want to upgrade the iPad, you need to consider the rationale behind the iPad. If you look at the history of the iPad, the first iPad was released on April 3rd, 2010, and the current version is the 7th generation iPad released on the 25th September 2019. Another category called iPad mini. The current iPad mini is the 5th generation, which was released on the 18th March 2019. And the third category called iPad Air, which right now is in its third generation, released on the 18th March 2019. The top end of the iPad, called iPad Pro, the second generation 11-inch and fourth generation 12.9-inch iPad Pro, released on March 25th, 2020. What's the general functions for iPad? Normally, the user interface is built around the device's multi-touch screen, including a virtual keyboard. All iPads can connect with Wi-Fi. Some models also have cellular connectivity. iPads can shoot video, take photos, play music, and perform internet functions such as web browsing or emailing. You also can use iPad for many other functions, for example, play games or reference, or using as GPS navigation, social networking, and so on. And also can be enabled by downloading or install different apps. As of March 2016, the App Store have more than 1 million apps for the iPad by Apple or by third parties. First generation iPad established design precedents, some of which have persisted through all models. The second generation iPad 2 introduced a new thinner design, a dual-core Apple A5 processor, and VGA front-facing and 720p rear-facing cameras designed for FaceTime video calling. However, the third generations added a Retina display, a better display screen, and new Apple A5X processors with a quad-core graphic processor, a 5-megapixel camera, HD video recording, a voice detection, and 4G. From the fourth generation, the iPad using an Apple A6X processor and replaced 30-pin connector with digital lightning connector. The fifth generation added the Apple A9 processor, which is much powerful, and with sacrificing some of the improvement of the iPad Air 2 introduced in exchange for a lower launch price. The sixth generation has an Apple A10 Fusion processor and Apple Pencil support. And the seventh generation features a bigger 10.2-inch display with the same Apple A10 Fusion processor and supports Apple Smart Cable. This one you can see, between the 6th generation and the 7th generation, the processor were the same, but the only difference is a slightly larger screen. The next category called iPad Air. The iPad Air added the Apple A7 processor and the Apple M7 motion coprocessor and reduced the thickness for the first time. So the idea of having the iPad Air, which is thinner or lighter than the normal iPad. But from the iPad Air 2, it added A8X processor and Apple M8 motion coprocessor, an 8-megapixel camera, and the Touch ID fingerprint sensor, and further reduced the thickness. From each generation, the thickness are the main focus for iPad Air. The 3rd generation iPad Air has the 10.5-inch display and Apple A12 Bionic processor and support Apple Pencil and Apple Smart Keyboard. iPad mini is the small version of the iPad, which have a screen size of 7.9-inch, 20 cm, but normally the other iPad is larger than 9.7-inch. The reason for the smaller screen is mainly targeting for female users. For example, like a girl or lady who used to have a small bag. For the large screen iPad or iPad Air, it's difficult to be fit into a small bag, but for the iPad mini, you can do that very easily. The 1st generation have similar internal specification to the iPad 2, but use the Lightning connector instead. The iPad mini 2 added the Retina display and the Apple A7 processor and the Apple M7 motion coprocessor, closely matching the internal specification of iPad Air. The iPad mini 3 added the Touch ID fingerprint sensor with the same Apple A7 processor, but the iPad mini 4 feature of Apple A8 processor and the Apple M8 motion coprocessor and an upgraded camera. The camera of iPad mini 4 is better than the 3. The 5th generation featured a much powerful Apple A12 Bionic processor and supporting Apple Pencil. iPad Pro is the top end of the iPad theory. There have been 4 generations of iPad Pro. All generations have included a 12.9 screen size option, with the other being 9.7 in first, 10.5 in second, or 11-inch in the 3rd and 4th generation of the iPad Pro. This table I just want to compare side by side between the iPad and iPad mini. Like I mentioned to you before, iPad used to have a large screen, however iPad mini have a smaller screen. If you look at the recent version, iPad 7th generation on the middle and the iPad mini 5th generation on the right hand side, they both run iPad.OS 13.1 or 13.51. They are very similar. And the processor, of course, iPad mini 5th generation are slightly better, more powerful. And for the storage, they have different options. But look at the screen size. iPad is 10.2-inch, iPad mini is 7.9-inch. So it depends. If you want a larger screen, go to iPad. If you want smaller screen or easy to carry or lighter, for the iPad mini. But the camera on the back are similar. There is no difference. And however, there is significant difference on the camera on the front. For the iPad is 1.2 megapixel. For the iPad mini is 7 megapixel. It's much better quality and resolution for the iPad mini. However, if you just use a video conference, 1.2 megapixel may be good enough. So you don't have to spend more money, or you don't have to specifically choose iPad mini because of the front camera. All the other things are very similar, only difference is the weight. iPad weight 1.074 pounds, which is nearly 500 grams. But for the iPad mini, only 300 grams. It's much lighter, easy to carry by single hand. Another thing you may consider is the price. For the bottom line of the iPad 7th generation, you can get a 32 GB for £329, but on the iPad mini, you spend $399 for a 64 GB storage iPad mini 5th generation. In fact, this price is very similar because you got a large storage and a slightly better camera. Between these two is about if you want a larger screen, if you want a lighter, small size of the iPad. You can make the decision very easily between these two. This one just compare the iPad, iPad Air and iPad Pro. Which one you want? Which one may be good for you? When you compare the operating system, they are very similar. They all use iPad OS 13.1, 13.5.1. Very similar. The processor, of course, they are very different. For the iPad, you have the Apple A10 processor. For the iPad Air 3, it's A12. For iPad Pro, it's A12X, which is much powerful compared from the left to the right hand side. For the memory, and the iPad and iPad Air 3 are very similar. They are 3 GB the RAM, but for the iPad Pro, you got doubled 6 GB the RAM. For the storage, they are different. For the iPad Pro, you have more options. You can get up to 1 GB the storage space for iPad Pro. For the display, both iPad and iPad Air 3 are similar. It's 10.5 inch. However, the iPad Pro, you got 11 inch. It's slightly bigger, very little. You may not recognize difference. If you look at the camera on the back, the iPad and iPad Air have very similar camera, HD still and video camera and 8 megapixel. In comparison, the iPad Pro, the 3rd generation, give you a 12 megapixel camera, and also you will have an ultra wide camera which give you 10 megapixel camera. So which means if you use iPad to take photo a lot, which you probably want to go to iPad Pro on the right hand side because much better quality of the photo. However, if you prefer use iPhone or use other smartphone take photo, you think iPad may be too big to take photo. In that way, the iPad Air will be good enough for you. For the front camera, you will see the difference because both iPad Air 3 and iPad Pro give you 7 megapixel front camera. However, the iPad only give you 1.2 megapixel camera in the front. Okay, the Wi-Fi connectivity is similar, even the Bluetooth for the iPad Pro using 5.0 technology rather than 2.4. But the thickness, of course, the iPad Air 3 and the iPad Pro will be slightly thinner compared with the iPad. The weight, they are very similar, not much difference. Very different is the connector because both iPad Air 3 still use the Lightning connector. However, iPad Pro start using USB-C connector, which you can share the charge with other smartphone or tablets easily. And also in the additional feature, both iPad and iPad Air 3 use iPad Pencil 1st generation, but iPad Pro 3rd generation, you can use a 2nd generation iPad Pencil. And also, very often the iPad Pro have advantages. They always have the quad stereo speakers, which means you have 4 speakers, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, which give you a better sound if you're using the iPad to listen music. But the price-wise is make you a difference when you make the decision. Because the bottom line for iPad, you can spend 300 quid to get one for 32 GB. But for iPad 3, you will need 460 for 64 GB. For the iPad Pro, you need 769 to get 128 GB. So which means if you compare between these three, so it depends. If you want a more powerful, better camera, will be iPad Pro, but much more expensive. If you want a better sound quality, of course, iPad Pro. If you just use your iPad for day-to-day entertaining, like watch videos and internet searching things, and maybe use some PowerPoint or Word documents editing, in that way, iPad or iPad Air will be good enough. If you have problem with the budget, your money, of course, iPad will give the most cost-effective when you decide to purchase your first iPad. Let's look at the iPad Air 1, 2, 3, because iPad Air is the middle range compared with iPad and iPad Pro. If you are struggling to decide which category you are going to, let's compare the iPad Air 1, 2, 3. And also, if you are currently have an iPad Air 1, iPad Air 2, do you need to upgrade iPad Air 3? So on the left-hand side is iPad Air first generation, middle is iPad 2, on the right-hand side is the iPad Air 3. If you look at the operating system, iPad Air 2 and iPad Air 3 operate a new system is the iPad OS 13, but iPad Air you still use iOS 12. The processor, of course, the iPad 3 is much powerful compared with iPad 2 and iPad 1. And if you look at the RAM, iPad Air got 1 GB, iPad Air 2 got 2 GB, iPad Air 3 got 3 GB. How you decide when you want to upgrade your iPad Air? If you got iPad Air or iPad Air 2, if you do not feel they are slower when you're running your day-to-day function, you don't have to go to the 3 GB iPad Air 3, because you may not feel that, you may never need that. And the screen size-wise, iPad Air 2 is 9.7 inch, the iPad Air 3 is 10.5 inch, only very tiny different. If you look at the camera on the back, iPad Air 2 and iPad Air 3 give you 8 megapixel, better quality of the camera compared with iPad Air, we only have 5 megapixel camera on the back. For the front camera, iPad Air and iPad Air 2, it give you 1.2 megapixel, but the iPad Air 3 give you 7 megapixel. So if you say, compare, you use the back camera, of course, iPad Air 2 still give you very good camera, and no advantage you go to iPad Air 3 because they are same as iPad Air 2 compared with the back camera. If you look at the thickness, iPad Air is 7.5, it's much thicker. iPad Air 2 and 3 is the same, 6.1. So you do not have an advantage by move to iPad Air 3 to get thinner compared to iPad Air 2. So my son still get iPad Air 2 because he don't want to move to iPad Air 3. He want a large storage iPad Air 2. And my wife got iPad Air 3. It's a latest version, which better camera on the front. If you look at the price-wise, right now you will not able to buy new iPad Air, but you can get £260 less than 300 to get iPad Air 2, but you need 400 something to get iPad Air 3. If you have a limited budget, I would suggest you to get iPad Air 2, which have a very similar function to the iPad Air 3. You have a very good front camera, and also it's a thinner, same as iPad 3. It's no point spend the extra money to upgrade or to get the latest version. Okay, let's look at the high end of the iPad Pro. For example, I got an iPad Pro 1, but do I need to upgrade to iPad Pro 2 or 3? Let's compare between them. If you look at the operating system on the top, both three versions all operate iPad OS 13.51. No difference. I got the latest software myself. And if you look at the processor, of course, each generation will have much powerful processor compared with previous version. However, I think for my day-to-day using my iPad Pro, my iPad Pro first generation, I feel is good enough. I don't need much faster because I do not play the high-end games. So if you look at the memory, the iPad Pro already give you a 2 GB RAM. It's pretty good, much better than the other iPad category. If you look at the second generation, you have 4 GB, the third generation 6 GB. However, for me, I have enough, I think. I do not need to spend more money for 6 GB RAM because I may never need 6 GB RAM for running any software in my iPad. Of course, iPad Pro give you much more options for the storages. For the display, there's a slight difference. For example, for iPad Pro 1, you got 9.7 inch. For iPad Pro 2, you got 10.5, only tiny different. But iPad Pro 3, you got 11 inch, and the edge is much thinner. And if you look at the camera, 3 of this iPad Pro always give you a high resolution camera, 12 megapixel for 3 of them. You can see between the 3 generations, not much difference. For me, I have the first generation iPad Pro. I got the best front back camera. I can take a 4K video recording. If I upgrade second generation and third generation, I do not see the much difference and the need for spend extra money to take photos compared with my first generation. Of course, for the camera in the front, my iPad Pro already got a 5 megapixel, which is similar to the latest version iPad Air and iPad. But compared, do I need 7 megapixel for the second generation and the third generation? Maybe not. But of course, from function-wise and sensor-wise, the latest generation of iPad Pro always provides the best camera for your iPad compared with other versions. The Wi-Fi wise is similar. Battery, normally they all support 10-hour use. For the diameters, both first generation, second generation 6.1mm, and the third generation iPad Pro slightly thinner 5.9mm. The weight is pretty much very similar, and the very much difference is the connector. Both first and second generation use Lightning connector, and the iPad Pro third generation use USB-C connector. And also the iPad Pencil, the first 2 generation iPad Pro use the iPad Pencil first generation, and also for the iPad Pro third generation you use second generation iPad Pencil, and also you use Face ID in the third generation. For the first 2 generation is Touch ID. However, if you look at the price, this makes much difference when you make a decision. For example, you can spend £300 to get a 32 GB iPad Pro 1, but you need 480 to get an iPad Pro 2, but you need 729 to get iPad Pro 3. If you do not want to spend too much money, iPad Pro 1 still be a very good option for you, because I still using iPad Pro 1. But if you want to get a better processor, go into the 2. But if you want to get the best camera or processor, or the latest version, the Face ID, of course, the iPad Pro 3 will be your option. But however, for me, I was thinking the first generation iPad Pro still very powerful compared with iPad or iPad Air 3. So let's talk about the iPad Pro 2020, which is the latest high-end iPad in the iPad categories. However, if you look at the review, people say, although the addition in RAM and change in storage option were welcomed, the 2020 model of the iPad Pro was seen as a minor enhancement amongst technology reviewers. Of course, the LiDAR sensor for increased AR capability or a new camera setup provide a good image quality because you have the wide angle lens as well. But in general, the technical reviewer do not feel there's much improvement compared with the previous version of the iPad Pro 2. Okay, let's do a summary. Do you need to upgrade your iPad? You ask this question yourself. For example, can your current iPad meet your day-to-day need? If your current iPad you have no problem at all, then you don't have to upgrade. For example, you may feel your storage is small. In that way, think about increase the storage of your iPad rather than go to iPad Pro. End of the day, it's about what you need and what the iPad offer you. Compare these two, will be not very difficult for you to find the best iPad for yourself. It's not the latest one, not the expensive one. It's the best one which can meet your day-to-day usage. This is very important. Okay, thank you for watching. If you like this video, please do remember subscribe to my channel and you will not miss any future videos.